To shape future communities, we must know what makes great cities today.
Whose reality counts? That's the challenge about good design, to actually consider whose reality counts when designing.
Like UNSW, consider every angle. Question and challenge what's possible.
Design the spatial experience, choreograph that, and then just let the buildings fit in around it.
Redefine what place means.
I realised that small children perceive a three-dimensional city in a way that none of us as adults really do.
For people, for the planet, for the future.
We have to cultivate a new agency for design, expect the uncertainty, and actually revel in the biodiversity around us.
Challenge, explore, and innovate the built environment to create a better tomorrow.
Good evening, everybody. I was so busy watching that and enjoying the familiar faces. It was a joy to see. Thank you all for being here. Hello and welcome to our 8th annual Judith Neilson lecture, which is part of the school's prestigious UTZON lecture series, launched in 2010 to celebrate the renowned Danish architect, UNSW, who we saw just now. My name is David Sanderson, and I'm the inaugural Judith Neilson Chair in Architecture in the School of the Built Environment here at UNSW, the University of New South Wales. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded lands of the Bedjigal people on whose land we are currently on. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of Indigenous Australia. This year's speaker, a friend and colleague, Professor Briony Rogers, who I'll introduce in a moment, and I said I'm going to embarrass you slightly, I hope you don't mind about that, but you follow on from a rich series of speakers, each of whom have talked engagingly about built environment and societal challenges. In fact, we just saw one or two people just there. In recent years, Professor Georgia Forey highlighted how corruption in construction fuels disasters. There's no such thing as a natural disaster. We're part of the story. While Arup's Dame Jo De Silva, who you just saw there, introduced seeing cities through the eyes of children, an amazing talk some years ago. And last year's talk on detecting illegal Chinese detention centers was delivered by Alison Killing, the first ever architect to win a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. It was a total thrill to have Alison join us last year. But to this year's speaker, who carries on a rich tradition of the Judith Neilson UTZON talks. Briony Rogers is a professor at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, that's MSDI, where she is CEO of Fire to Flourish and director of MSDI Water. Briony's career is focused on strengthening how communities and practitioners create conditions for thriving communities. And we'll hear a lot about communities. That's very much the focus of tonight in Briony's work. She is interested in how change can be catalyzed with an emphasis on collaborative processes that shift policy and practice for the better. We were just chatting earlier, and it's about so what, hey? It's all about so what. How do we change things? And I was privileged to see your slides beforehand, and it is about how do we change things. As CEO of Fire to Flourish, a community disaster resilience program, Briony leads a team of community members, researchers, and practitioners to advance community-led disaster resilience through a focus on strengthening community leadership, capabilities, and social capital. Through MSDI Water, Briony brings together experts in water, sustainability, governance, and systems change. I'm near the end. Briony has a PhD in environmental sociology, a Bachelor of Civil Engineering, and a Bachelor of Science, and a background in engineering consulting. In 2014, Briony was selected by the International Social Science Council as one of 20 world-leading social science fellows in the area of sustainable urbanization. I think you'll agree that we have a fabulous speaker tonight, so please join me in welcoming Briony to the stage.
I too would like to pay my respects to the Bidjilgal people here in the Eora Nation and recognise and acknowledge the Indigenous leadership across Australia. The Indigenous people have been the ultimate of resilient peoples around our nation, and they've just demonstrated amazing capacity and strength when it comes to facing all kinds of challenges and also showing the way in terms of systems change, systems thinking, envisioning futures where we're connected with our land, connected with our waters, and having a deep stewardship approach. Thank you so much, David, for welcoming me and for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation around the big realities that are facing us around climate change. The impacts are being experienced all over the country, all over the world, and the facts are endless, just evidencing where we are, where we find ourselves as a society, as humanity, and as a globe. Before I get into that, though, a little bit about me. So I grew up in Melbourne with a single mum, and she helped embed in me a really deep sense of responsibility. Two of us at home, I was part of the team, we had to work together to get things done. And we had a lot of conversations around social justice and feeling connected to our community. And I was always shy, fairly introverted, so I found structured ways to connect with my community through sport or whatever it was. And so that sense of feeling connected and feeling belonging. And Mum and I shared a real sense of optimism. We didn't have much money growing up, but we always had that sense of things can get better, and we have the agency and the power to drive things and to make things better. And those sorts of values, that responsibility, the community, and a sense of optimism, I guess have shaped my career. I get incredibly frustrated when the rules that someone wrote somewhere aren't working for us, that they're getting in the way of the sorts of lives that we want to lead, or the sorts of cities we want to shape, or the sorts of communities we want to grow. So that sense of we can change things. If humans wrote the rules and they're not working for us, then humans can change the rules. And that's the flavour, I guess, of my lecture this evening. I started out in engineering, doing water engineering. It was right in the peak of the millennium drought in 2006. I was a graduate water engineer, and so got thrown in the deep end with all sorts of major water infrastructure projects to work on. And then after quite a few years, I realised that my passion for sustainability and resilience and my interest in how communities engage in water and in the world, that engineering was only part of the solution. It's a really, really important part of the solution, but it's only part of it. And so I wanted to learn more about all the other parts, all the other levers that we have, the governance settings, the policies, the plans, the way we design our cities and our places, the way we engage with people. And so I went back to university to do my PhD in systems change, and in particular focused on water systems. How do we bring people together, all of those different stakeholders and people and organisations that have a role to play in our water, shaping our water and shaping our cities? How do we bring them together around a shared vision of the future and be aligned in the sorts of strategic actions to get us there? So that was my PhD. I then had the opportunity with the Cooperative Research Centre for Water Sensitive Cities to join a movement. Now this CRC, some of you might be aware, it was large. It was a 9-year collaborative research program with more than 80 industry and government partners ranging from local councils, water utilities, state government agencies, consultants, developers, universities, all coming together around a question, a recognition really, that all the assumptions we had previously around rainfall patterns, growth of cities and so on, they were no longer going to hold. And we had to rethink and reimagine how we wanted to shape our cities and their water sustainability into the future. And so the really powerful model of bringing all of those different groups together and investing shared energy in that direction. So that saw me through, and then in 2019 and 20, the devastating bushfires hit around Australia, and so I had the opportunity to take that thinking around resilience and collaboration and vision and connection and think about that in the context of community through the Fire to Flourish program. So I'm going to start there. I'm not going to rehearse the facts and the figures around climate change. It's here. We're experiencing it. It's scary. It's a bit overwhelming at times. If I think too deeply about it, it can be quite paralysing. And yet we need to do something. If the rules that we've set for ourselves as society aren't letting us work in the ways that we need, design and build in the ways that we need, connect in the ways that we need to do something about it. Imagine for a moment that you were in Grafton, in the Clarence Valley. This is one of the partner communities of Fire to Flourish. Years and years of drought, all the economic challenges that come with that, all the social challenges that come with drought, and a very, very dry landscape. And then hit the most devastating bushfire season that we've had in Australia. 6 months, we talk about black summer for that period, but in fact it wasn't summer. The fire started in August, and it started in areas that had never ever burned before. Huge swathes of land wiped out, and the impact on the people and their sense of optimism and their ability to cope, barely coping, that was all obviously really very devastating. And one of the key ingredients that matters when a community is recovering from disaster is the ability to come together and to heal together and to grow together, post-traumatic growth. But of course, this person we're imagining in Grafton was hit by COVID, as we all were. And so all of that important time to come back together as a community and say, now what? Now how are we going to rebuild from here, and how are we going to grow our community to be stronger? People couldn't come together for months and months, and if not years. And then just a short time later, the floods hit. Huge floods, again, unprecedented in their scale. And if we keep using the word unprecedented, we might get the hang of this. The future is quite terrifying. So one family that we're working with, they had their house wiped out by the fires, and then just 12 months later, they had their business wiped out by floods. And then this community in the Clarence Valley, just in the last month, they've been hit again. As I'm now thinking about Nimboida, which is just outside of Grafton. So these community members are already deeply traumatised and tired and exhausted, but once again defending their homes against the flames. And in the communities we're working with through Fire to Flourish, the anxiety is high. The trauma is still there, and there's wonderful research by Melbourne University, Lisa Gibbs and colleagues, talking about the fact that recovery from a major bushfire, it's a 10-year plus journey. This is not something that happens in just a few years. All of these disaster experiences around the country have been a real reckoning for us. And, you can hear the commentary in the media around how communities have felt unsupported, felt left behind. This might be because the funding models didn't work for people, that the sorts of recovery support financially that was available either had really tight timeframes, or the criteria for the grants didn't meet what communities were needing, or they were pitting communities against each other. So, two different parts of a community having equally valid and priority needs from a recovery perspective, competing against each other for limited funding to invest in that recovery journey. Aboriginal communities either experiencing culturally unsafe, if not explicit racism, in the way that they were supported. We've heard anecdotes in some of our partner communities about Aboriginal elders being turned away from recovery centres because enough of their mob had been supported that day already. Really heartbreaking stories. And yet we've also heard incredible stories of Aboriginal leadership stepping up and helping their whole community, drawing on that deep knowledge of country and connection with community to provide strength in that time of crisis. There's a picture here emerging that we are not yet set up for this future, for this current reality. Our communities are not yet being supported in the ways that they need. And so all the old assumptions, all the old rules that we've been following to support communities in these extreme weather events, we need to start questioning. This model here is the typical model behind our emergency management services: prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. But this community we've been talking about, Nimboida in the Clarence Valley, they're not just on a recovery journey. At the same time, they've needed to be looking at reducing their disaster risk, getting ready for an extreme weather season, responding to the fires and defending while still on their recovery journey. This creates a lot more complexity to how communities need to be supported. And so in the last few years, there's been a real emerging renewed focus on resilience. The word resilience and the idea of resilience has existed for a good few decades in the context of disaster, but it hasn't had the momentum that's now building around it. And in Fire to Flourish, and in general, the idea of resilience, I guess, brings together that concept and the framing around disaster risk and disaster impact, but embeds that in a backdrop of community development. Because when a disaster hits, it's a moment in time for a community, but that's with a long backdrop, a long history of that community and its stories and evolutions. And it's got a long future ahead of it. And the disaster is a major disruptor that can be devastating and can set a community off on a downward trajectory in terms of its well-being, its ability to flourish. And in particular, communities experiencing long-term entrenched disadvantage are more typically exposed to higher disaster risk, have less capacities and resources to draw on because of that systemic lack of investment in basic infrastructure, education, health services, and so on. And so you get this vicious cycle: the higher disaster risk, more impacts, more disadvantage. So we need to turn that around. We've got to recognise that we can, by investing in community and investing in community development, we can be increasing the flourishing of that community while supporting that community to be able to reduce its disaster risk and reduce its impacts. And the way we're talking about this at Fire to Flourish is the idea of transformative resilience. When we think about the capacities that a community needs to have when it's facing a disaster or thinking about a disaster into the future, its ability to cope when that disaster hits, to be able to respond and to cope. But it also needs to be able to change. A community needs to have the capacity to adapt to the changing circumstances, adapt the way that it convenes, adapt the way that it shapes its environment, and really importantly, transformative capacities to get right down into the deep systemic issues, the root causes of all the challenges that are getting in the way of a community thriving. And to get to that transformative capacity, we need to be focused on self-determination, community-led. And there's an excellent quote here by one of our advisory board members, Jason Adler: "There must be a commitment to do with, not to do for, to ask, not to tell, to seek to understand, not to assume or judge, to negotiate, not consult, and to partner, not just engage." To take this sort of approach, this self-determined, community-led approach, is systems change. And if we look at the hierarchy, the traditional ways that our emergency management and disaster sector is set up, it's that we've got our national bodies, our district and state, our local governments, and then our communities. And many parts of the system don't actually distinguish, don't recognise that a local government doesn't necessarily represent their community. But the communities we speak with and work with are all very clear that the local government might be doing an excellent job, but they are not the community at large. And so we need to be thinking about how do we flip this hierarchy so that community are at the centre and that there's trusting relationships with each of the layers of support and governance around it. These are the sorts of ideas that we're experimenting with and exploring in Fire to Flourish. We're trialling and scaling new ways of working with community that do this enabling and this empowering effort to really support community-led resilience building and really embedding ways of working like exploring, co-designing, co-creating, and recognising that communities are partners in the knowledge generation and change work that we need to be seeing. There's a few principles guiding the work that we're doing being community-led. Foregrounding Aboriginal wisdom. This has been transformative for our program. Not only is it an important thing for Australia to be focusing on to support self-determination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, particularly in the disaster resilience space, but the knowledge and the wisdom that comes with that deep connection to culture and deep connection to country, and really the original systems thinker has been an important and profound way of unlocking new ideas and new directions from a change perspective. Addressing inequities, strengths-based, being impactful, and really importantly, learning, adapting and evolving. I think whenever we talk about change, we need to recognise that this requires innovation, which means some of the things we're trying won't work. And that's good because we need to learn from our failures. We need to learn from the things that haven't worked so that we can constantly be figuring out what does. So we're working with 4 communities across New South Wales and Victoria, up in northern New South Wales in the Clarence Valley and in Tenterfield, down on the south coast in Eurobodalla and in East Gippsland. And all of these communities were severely affected by the 2019-2020 fires, low levels of, on the socioeconomic indicators of disadvantage, and higher than average populations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we're weaving research through the work we're doing on the ground with the community so that we can be learning as we go. Participatory processes that bring people together to envision change, to develop shared priorities, and to have a collective understanding of the strengths and capacities and needs that exist within a community. The grant-funded projects, so we've got grant funding available to support our communities, but experimenting with an idea of participatory granting. So this is where communities have the power to make decisions collectively around how they want to invest in their recovery and their resilience building. And then a real focus on social capital. So building the capabilities in communities, strengthening the networks, because all the evidence points to social capital as being the most important resilience factor for communities. And then through our research, weaving in evidence generation, insights, developing tools and models that can be taken up at scale, and practical guidance, recommendations, and networks of change agents to ultimately drive that system change. Just a few photos. Placemaking is one of the elements, so bringing people in a community together to envision a resilient place and a thriving place. Projects that are funded through the granting range from emergency management equipment and technology like UHF radios and lawnmowers to reduce the risk, through to events, cultural events and music events that bring people together to strengthen those connections. First Nations cultural connections, food security, really holistic, and that's been a really important feature to recognise that when we're talking about disaster resilience, it's actually leaning into all of those social, environmental, economic, built environment, health and wellbeing elements, because all of that together is what makes a community strong. And thinking about the capabilities that are needed in a community and that already exist in the community, often there's a deficit framing. The poor community over there has been hit by a disaster and the outsiders need to come in and help them. Sometimes outside support is absolutely needed, and community-led doesn't mean community alone. But we're not yet recognising all that strength and capacity that needs to be resourced and unlocked. And when it is, that starts to create a real opportunity for thinking about transforming the way that we work and the partnerships needed to be able to cope, adapt and transform in the face of climate change impacts. And that network strengthening that I've talked about. I've got a small video that brings to life some of the work that we're doing through Fire to Flourish. If we can bring the video up.
Welcome everybody here today to the Bangi country, and hopefully have a meaningful discussion, I guess, today. Thank you.
Placemaking, we see, is a collaborative and people-centred approach to improving the built natural environment in your area.
So the first task will be a walking exercise where we're going to walk around Glenray. We've got this massive aerial image maps in front of you, and so walking routes that you've just done, all the information you collected, we're going to get you to synthesize it into little icon pins.
New picture, and it just had a little scale, and it was just inside the building.
Alright, thank you very much to all of you for being here today, sharing your thoughts, ideas for the Aurora Valley and Glenray. We are very thankful for your openness about your town, your communities, and we hope to use everything that you've produced today, everything that you've come up with for the next stage of the program. So yeah, thank you very much, and give everybody a clap.
More and more community people are connecting up with us and actually seeking us out now because they've heard of this Fire to Flourish and they've heard that we're doing it, and they're obviously hearing good things because they're wanting to have conversations about what can happen in their patch.
The trust and the acceptance has really come strong in the last 6 months that people have for us, which is really good to see.
I think I'm most proud of the way our co-design team has stepped up to the plate. I'm constantly amazed by the common sense and the cooperation and the ideas that are coming from them.
We've developed a really good collegial approach to working in such a diverse and geographically spread community. And I think that's been probably the thing that's allowed us to be able to achieve what we've achieved. Like that wonderful saying, we keep reusing, travelling at the speed of trust. We're now travelling faster because the trust has been developed and people are just wanting us to be involved and wanting us to facilitate things within their communities.
When we first started, somebody said, "Oh, why is this foreground in Aboriginal wisdom? What's that got to do with anything? Why does Monash want that?" And now we're up to the stage where people are realising when you talk about culture, it's not just Aboriginal culture. It's the culture of the community. It's a culture of farmers. It's a culture of different groups of people. But yeah, I think the appreciation of Aboriginal culture in amongst all that is, I see a difference in the way people are treating me.
And the benefits also, I think, is the collaboration, not just within the co-designers, but also the people who are the champions of the projects, and being able to bring all of those people together and the relationships that we can see building has really been positive.
Here in Nimboida, we're doing lots of workshops on bushfire awareness and cultural burning practices and things like that, and having the quality of the conversations that we're having about what to do about the fire risk are so much more improved.
I see people reaching for more, thinking about the future, dreaming about what could be, and I think that is amazing to see, because when we lose that, it's like we lose the joy in our world, and our future and our kids' future. So watching people reach for more is really beautiful, and it also shows that people are healing.
We've had representatives come to the table from Clarence Valley Council, sitting at the table in our local meetings, which we've never had before. It's a really valuable process for community members and connectors that actually engage in the co-design process, because they come away and then they become the advocate for connecting in their area.
So what you're hearing there is the optimism when communities are trusted and empowered and resourced to come together and have the sorts of conversations that help make sense of what's going on and think about future and the climate risk that exists and the preparedness work that needs to be done and the action that needs to be taken. There's an optimism and a hope and a transformation that's going on in the communities that we're working with. And for me, this starts to point to where we need to head. If we've just realised that the last few years has shown us the business as usual is not working, then what do we need to do differently and how do we need to get there? So just a few highlights, and I won't read them all out, but the emerging insights we're gathering and learning together with our community partners, understanding community as a place-based system. There's complexity there, there's dynamics there, it's changing over time, there's different levels of capacity and interest and resource flows and power, and all of that is messy. And so you need to be supporting and empowering community to navigate that for themselves, because an outsider and a top-down model is not going to work. Giving focus to the social capital and the growth of those local capabilities, as well as innovative funding models that actually support communities to take the action and do the investments that they know are right for them. Connecting to country, connecting to culture, embracing Indigenous leadership, and investing in caring for country as a holistic practice that supports not only cultural benefit and social and economic and community benefit for the Indigenous community, but supports healing country and land management that reduces disaster risk. And then importantly, embedding community voice in decision making. The ways that policies and programs are designed in our disaster resilience space at the moment doesn't yet do enough to have community voice front and centre at the table. So as I've been sitting back and learning these lessons along with our community partners in the Fire to Flourish space, a lot of these directions are sounding really familiar to me. And that's because these same ideas and these same patterns are emerging through the water sector. The water sector had its wake-up call in the 2006, or 2000 to 2010 millennium drought, 2006 for me when I started as a graduate engineer. You know, we had critical drought across the country, major infrastructure investments were needed to augment water supplies. Every sports field, every community space and place was brown, you know, in all the major cities, and we realised the value of water. It's not just about the taps and the toilets, it's actually about water in the landscape and people's connection to water and their, you know, the thriving and green landscapes that are really important to us. And then the drought broke with catastrophic floods around the country. And through all of this experience, we can look back and realise the same sorts of conclusions, that the journey of how we've shaped our water systems to service us has been evolving, and we now as a community have much broader expectations of the livability of our communities and the livability of our cities. And therefore we need to think differently because all the old assumptions around our climate patterns are no longer holding as well. So how are we going to lean into this? What's the change agenda? As I said at the start, I was fortunate to be part of the Water Sensitive Cities Cooperative Research Centre, and these Water Sensitive Cities principles has been a really important touchstones for the water sector. Other language might be used, integrated water management. I'm not fussed about the jargon, but the ideas behind it is important. Cities as water supply catchments. In most major cities in Australia, the amount of rainfall that lands on our city footprint is more than enough that we need in terms of drinking and consumption, but we don't catch it. We don't capture it and harvest it and clean it in ways that we can utilise that as a resource. There are some really amazing, innovative projects that are starting to build in recycling, stormwater harvesting, and that's starting to take off. But this really needs to be led into, and to recognise that not all the water we use needs to be at drinking water quality. Sometimes, you know, we can have lower quality water that serves just as good a job. Cities providing ecosystem services, we know a lot about the damage, the impact that cities have on our ecosystem services, but if we reimagine how we design and shape our built environment, can actually provide ecosystem value, you know, through greening, through cleaning our water with nature-based solutions, food production and so on. And cities with water-sensitive communities, recognising that socio-political capital, community feeling the role of being a steward of their local area, their local waterscape, is a really important pathway, and we need to be fostering that connection to water and that sense of responsibility in our communities. Part of my research over the CRC for Water Sensitive Cities was action research, with hundreds of people involved in the water sector in some way or some shape or form around the country, and got to have all kinds of conversations around, you know, where do we find ourselves? What's our vision for the future? What are the barriers? How do we change? What are our priorities? And what emerged out of that was a real shared vision. Every context is different, just like every community is different when we're talking about disaster resilience. But there are common themes that are emerging. Happy, active people, green spaces, healthy ecosystems, innovation, efficient resource use, collaborative integrated governance, empowered community stewardship, First Nations knowledge and values. You can see these themes, they really parallel and align with what is being experienced and learned through the disaster space. And this research also explored the change pathways. Well, if we've got a vision for a water-sensitive future, how do we get there, given our traditional water systems are typically designed big pipes in, big pipes out, it's all underground. We are designing and managing our systems for single objectives, not thinking about that integrated whole. So we need to change our on-ground practices. We've got to change the way we plan and design to take that integrated view, to bridge across silos so that people involved in the planning people involved in the landscape design, people involved in the water engineering, people involved in the community engagement, that they're all coming together to take a shared view. And we need to enable that through structures like policies and strategies and plans and incentives, as well as that socio-political capital, the leadership, the vision, the capacity, the networks. And so now if I step right back and look across the water and the disaster space, there's some clear patterns in the way that we need to be thinking about things going forward. We need to think holistically. We need to move beyond our silos. How do we bring all of these different ways of thinking together? And place-based work that really empowers that local knowledge, that local capacity is critical. There is not a one-size-fits-all solution, that every community and every city is different, but there are building blocks that appear to be really important and really promising. So how do we bridge across silos, bring different knowledge systems together? How do we be creative and investing in small incremental ways over the long term? In the Millennium Drought, we were not ready as a country. All the projections, all the future predictions of rainfall said we were 20, 30, 40 years off needing any major augmentations to our water supply. But within 2 years, we were having to make really critical, major investments in infrastructure in a setting where it was difficult to bring the community along some of that journey. For example, the Melbourne desalination plant had huge community backlash because every community member had been doing their bit, doing the buckets in the shower, investing in the water efficient appliances, and then a major infrastructure decision was made. I'm not commenting on whether that was the right or wrong decision, but we need to be able to get to a point where we're investing for resilience over time and not waiting for those crisis moments. Decentralisation is a common theme. That if we're taking that place-based view and we know that all the capacity needs to come from a local source, then we need to be okay with some power sharing and investing, whether that's in local government that has a really important role to play in that local community servicing, or in grassroots community members, that the top-down, just like big pipes in, big pipes out from an infrastructure perspective is no longer fit for purpose. Big governance models that don't unlock that local capacity is also no longer fit for purpose. So we've got to be investing in all of that. It's quite overwhelming when we think about the many different changes that are needed to get us there. But it's also heartening to think about the big changes we have already gone through as society. Just take a moment, think back 30, 40, 50 years. What are some of the big changes that we've experienced? We've gone from horse and cart to the automobile. We've got gender rights. We've got marriage equality. We've got amazing technological innovations. The crisis, the situation we find ourselves, it's quite overwhelming, but we can think proactively and constructively and lean into that change agenda. The first thing we have to do, though, is recognise and embrace and understand the sort of system that we're working with. This is obviously not a simple system. We're not just making toast. It's also not a complicated system. A plane is a complicated system. It's a machine with many different parts that need to come together and work together, and you need really highly specialised technical knowledge to get that plane in the air and have it land safely. But in general, if you pull the lever, the thing you expect to do will happen. And most planes have some fairly common bits and pieces sitting within it. What we're talking about is a complex system. Imagine a child. A child is not a machine. It grows, it evolves, and the influences around it shape how it engages in the world. It has role models and supports and coaches of various forms helping a child grow from an infant up to a thriving adult. And this is the way we need to think about our water system, our disaster resilience system. Whichever system we're thinking about this change, let's lean into this complexity. And what's critical is that we're not breaking down the machine into its individual component parts. We're seeing it as a network. And the relationships between those individual parts is key. And when we think about those relationships and all the different ways those relationships can evolve, we see that many different things are possible. But we can't command and control a child. We can't command and control a Great Barrier Reef. We can't command and control our ecosystem of people and infrastructure and systems. There's too many uncertainties and surprises when those relationships between the parts come together in different ways. But the key feature of a complex adaptive system is that it can adapt, it can learn, it can sense. And this is how we need to start engaging with the world. Whether our job is as an engineer, as a community engagement, as a policymaker, we need to start thinking in terms of systems, align on a vision of where we want to head, sense what's going on, find the leverage points of change. It's helpful to think about how change unfolds in these sorts of complex systems. You might have seen this sort of curve in other settings, but it basically reflects that this is not a linear, straightforward pathway. There might be long periods of slow, incremental change that feels like you're not getting anywhere, but then there'll be a tipping point. And at some point, that tipping point starts to send you off on an accelerated journey until we start to stabilise into a new way of doing things or a new technology being adopted or whatever it is. It's depicted here as smooth and clean, but there's obviously lots of pitfalls along the way. Path dependency is a big issue. What I mean by that is all the things we've been investing in for decades and decades before make it very difficult to start investing in something different. If you've got billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, big pipes infrastructure that's in the ground now, to start investing in small bits and pieces of infrastructure in that decentralised way feels challenging. And often we find ourselves getting locked into efficiency-only innovations. So for example, if we start to invest in energy-efficient appliances in our house, that's great. But if we start to build our houses 3 times as big with 3 times as many appliances, we're not getting any net gains. So we want to avoid lock-in. We want to avoid backlash. There might be some really promising innovations, new ways of doing things that seem like they've got awesome uptake, really great promise, it's going to save the world, but the implementation detail might not be thought through. The pink bats insulation crisis is a good example here, where great idea, great technology, but some of the implementation detail wasn't thought through or not implemented properly without the right regulatory settings to tragic results. So we want to avoid backlash. We've got to think through how are these new solutions and new practices going to be embedded. We could also say this is too hard. We can't actually deal with this, and the change is too big and too difficult and too contested. But it doesn't mean change isn't going to happen. It just means that that change will be imposed on us. And so how do we start to shape and steer and find the leverage points to stay on this line to our new practices in whatever domain we're working in? Another model I find really helpful is this iceberg model that effectively talks about the things that we see above the waterline, the events, the patterns, the things that we observe, actually influenced by a whole lot of other things that sit under that waterline. At the most shallow level, the policies and the practices, the way we organise our resource flows are influencing what we experience above the waterline. We need to change them. But if we really want to drive and need to drive down into transformative change, which is what we're facing right now, we've got to get right down into the relational changes, the power dynamics. Who's got power in a particular setting? What relationships exist? How are we connecting? And then ultimately our mental models, our paradigms. How are we understanding ourselves? How are we understanding our connection to nature? How are we understanding the role of community in a disaster? I find the power dynamics one a really interesting one from both the water and the emergency and disaster space. In the water sector, part of the change journey conversations I've been having over the last decade is with engineers who feel quite threatened. All of a sudden, their role as the dominant decision maker and designer of all things water is no longer, they're no longer holding that same power. And the conversation has had to be, you have a really important role. We still need our water infrastructure to be designed excellently from an engineering perspective, but we also have to make room for other perspectives. We've got to make room for the landscape architects and the ecologists and the community members and so on. And so we've got to start creating more open spaces for different disciplinary perspectives to come together. And exactly the same conversation, I think, is happening in the disaster sector, where our emergency services, our firefighters, they've had an incredibly, and still have an incredibly important role to play when a community gets hit by disaster. And so sometimes there's a sense of feeling threatened that we're not going to have the same power, or there's so much risk that we're managing on behalf of the community that it's too risky to share power. That can't be the conversation. This is not about reducing any of the importance of the role of the fire and emergency services, but it's saying we need to make room for more. Community also have a role to play. Local government has a role to play. There's service providers. There's an ecosystem of players that need to come together to help get the best outcomes for community. There are a lot of barriers, and these barriers here apply both across the water and the disaster space. The governance settings aren't right, they're too hierarchical, our models for funding and pricing aren't fit for purpose, conservative risk appetite, and we could spend the next 50, 100 years taking down each brick at a time, and we do need to remove those bricks. But we don't have time to do that piece by piece. We need to start thinking about creating the springboard that leaps us over those bricks, leaps us over those barriers, to start seeing the transformative change now. And so it's helpful to think about, well, what enables change? Barriers are real, they're important, we've got to engage with them, but actually, what do we need to do proactively to come together to drive change? This is research that we've done that, I guess, consolidates all the different sorts of things that seem to help, seem to make a difference. We need champions. We need leadership at all scales. We need community leadership, scientific leadership, government leadership, industry leadership. All of this leadership needs to come together. And going down the column is, I guess, the maturity of a transition. So early in a transition, the sort of leadership that we might see and that might be important are activists, highlighting the problem, putting a spotlight and saying, guys, we've got to take this seriously. And as we get more mature and we lean into this change journey, then starting to see champions starting to speak up, advocating for new solutions, connecting up with each other and getting into influential positions so that ultimately you've got governments and multi-stakeholder networks driving this change agenda. So as I come towards the end of my talk, think about some of the questions that are on the slide. You know, in your roles, whatever roles they might be, how are you nurturing diversity in leadership? This is really important for change. How are we connecting champions to each other and connecting champions into positions of power? Are there organisations that can step up and be organisational champions of change? How do we grow networks for champions to come together and be supported? Another key enabler is platforms for connecting. We know that collaboration and integration is really important, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum. We need to be really intentional about creating these sorts of spaces so that we can bridge the silos, whether that's jurisdictional or disciplinary or sectoral. The water sector needs to work with the energy sector, needs to work with the planning sector, needs to work with the transport sector to create a place that helps communities thrive. T-shaped professionals, you might have heard of this idea before. This is a really important piece of the puzzle. The individuals need to have their deep disciplinary depth, but we've also got to be fostering in our professionals the skills that allow that collaboration, the soft skills that help people come together, that generate a sense of humility, a core value of humility, that you cannot do collaboration, you can't bring different knowledge systems together if you're coming at it from a perspective of, I know the way things work, and the way that I see going forward is what we all need to do. We've got to be able to come with humility, with open ears and open hearts to find a shared pathway forward. The CRC for Water Sensitive Cities was a really important platform for connecting, and those industry partners, 80 of them around the country, 3 universities, all around a shared vision and a shared agenda for change. And I think this sort of model of collaborative research is a really important direction. And just a shout out to my colleagues at the DisasterWise Communities Network. This is a network that Fire to Flourish has catalysed. There's all kinds of networks for policymakers and practitioners in the emergency and disaster space, but not yet a platform for community to connect with each other and learn from each other and provide peer support and access to resources and stories that help normalise, point to solutions and help communities on their journey. Knowledge. We need knowledge. We need new knowledge to deal with these challenges that we're facing, and we need to be really mindful, though, of whose knowledge are we listening to, whose knowledge might not be at the table. And I'm thinking particularly about community knowledge and community lived experience and lived expertise, as well as Indigenous and First Nations knowledge. How are we bringing those knowledge systems into the way we think about change? How are we bringing our systems thinking? How are we generating the scientific, evidence-based knowledge and how we're also developing the practical and experiential knowledge of putting new practices into the way we work. Projects. We need real, tangible projects that show what's possible. But we need to be very mindful that projects do not change systems. If you've ever had success measures of projects, they need to be on time and on budget and to quality. But if you're going to meet those criteria of being on time and quality and budget, then you're necessarily isolating that project from all the reality of the complex world that it's in. Instead, we need to be thinking about, how do projects help us learn? How do projects help us relate? How do projects help us come together so that we are aligned in terms of our vision and our strategy? We need to package things up so they're implementable, but projects don't change systems, processes do. Processes that help bring people together and have that transformative aha moment that gets right down into that mental model. And then finally, how are we developing the tools and the guidance, whether that's technical design guidance or administrative guidance, like policies and targets and standards? How are we codifying all the work that we need to do in tools and guidance that help drive change at scale? Because we fall into the trap of doing an amazing pilot project here and a demonstration project there. We need them when we're experimenting with new work, but then we need to be thinking about the scaling pathways. How are we going to rapidly learn about how these new ways of working can be put into place? And how do we get our governance settings, our resource settings, etc., ready to get that change at scale? A final thought I'll leave you with, and this is a quote that Professor Anne Polina around the Fitzroy River region has shared, amazing First Nations leader. All we have is time and energy. And we all have really important day jobs to do. But how do we start to bring into our day jobs all of these enablers of change? Because we don't have time to waste. We've got to start driving transformative shifts in the way that we're working, the way that we're engaging, really important, the way that we're relating with each other, so that we can start to pave our way forward into a shared transformative vision of the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Briony. There's so much to say, so much to unpack. For those of us working in this area, knowledgeable and experienced as we all are in this room around the realities, you touched on, I think, everything when it comes to the big issues. I mean, thank you for starting with a personal story. That's quite a thing to choose to share about growing up, single parent, and having that sense of connection. And then talking about fire and water and the elemental approach. You see what I did there? I sort of weave that in. Thinking about things that are pressing and serious in our lives right now in Australia, but also elsewhere, the existential risk, but yet also not ending or discussing for the most part what we can do, because we can make a difference. We've risen to the challenge before on other things, and this is our challenge for this and the next and the last generation, all that kind of stuff. But with energy and time, we can do many things. We have some time for questions. I'm selfishly going to ask the first one because I can, and it's of course an impossible question. You talk about business as usual. What's the one thing that frustrates you the most about it, about business as usual, that needs to change?
That there's not the trust in people. That there is a sense of, where power lies at the moment, that there's not yet the trust in what people can do, if supported, if invested in, if resourced, and if scaffolded, that change can happen. And it must happen, because we don't have the capacity for every community that's on fire all at the same time for people to be all supported at once. So we've got to start letting go and in building up that local capacity. So I think trust in each other, trust in community, and recognising that trust takes time. Roxanne in the video talked about moving at the pace of trust, and that's been a really important lesson or idea to hold on to in our Fire to Flourish program in particular, that if we're not building trust in our communities, then we can't do the work together. And so I think we don't prioritise at the moment in the way we set up our businesses and our work time for trust building and relationships, which is why I shared my personal story, because I think we need to meet human to human first, and then through that we can connect and grow that trust so that you can then do really productive, transformative work.
Wow. I'm sorry, I can't help but have a second question. How do the systems and institutions we have trust that trust? And how do they change to do that?
We need to have the conversations. We need to build those connections, and we need to explore together and co-create together. You know, one of the hesitations that we had in Fire to Flourish when we first started to engage with the communities we're working with to invite their participation was, how are they going to feel about the research part? How are they going to feel about the systems change part? There's so much they've gone through as a community, but you know, it's a really important part of the model that we're honouring those lived experiences by building the systematic learning and scaling into the work. But it's been incredible how much our community partners have valued this research and systems change elements, because they want to help other people. They want to be part of the solutions. If they're supported to really understand what's going on and the things we need to think about, then they're right up for it. And their voice and their experience and their expertise can be part of the co-creation of the way forward. So I think we've got to open up the spaces to invite those different sorts of conversations and different voices together.
Thank you. I'm going to hold off because I'm sure there are many questions. May I open the floor open to any questions? We have roving mics from our student ambassadors. If I could ask you, please, to name your name. And I heard once someone say that the best questions have a question mark at the end. So it'd be wonderful to open the floor to any questions. Do we have any questions?
So my name is Martin Locke. I'd just be interested in your views in how successful have the New South Wales government's efforts been around the Northern Rivers and the effort that they've made setting up the Reconstruction Corporation?
Yeah, the place-based approach is really important, and I think it's been some important directions and important steps in bringing different players around the table. I think there's still a major reckoning and shift that all governments are needing to go through in terms of really understanding and engaging with what it looks like to empower communities to be part of that journey with really strong and important voice. So important first steps, but collectively a long way to go.
Maybe I could just follow up on that. Given the complexity of the Northern Rivers and the terrible series of disasters there have been, and heaven forbid there are more, but you know, a lot of the signs are there's an ongoing thing there. You talked about old business as usual isn't working. Do we need to rethink recovery? Is it an ongoing thing? Is it a shift in something, do you think?
I mean, I think our reality is that many of the communities in high-risk areas are going to be perpetually in recovery. You know, that in the sense that the disasters are coming more frequently, and you know, the rebuilding work, the reconnecting, the healing work that's needed for people's mental health, all of that is changing a time dynamic, you know, in terms of what work needs to be done by community. I think one of the big challenges that we have at the moment is our funding models to support community work on the ground tend to be around disaster. A disaster has to hit, it needs to be declared a disaster, and then that unlocks funding that some community members, if they're really good at writing grant applications, can get access to be able to support their recovery. But we need to be having the funding models that support all that risk reduction work in a community-led way, the preparedness work. So what's the ongoing funding model that means the community can draw on the resources it needs at any stage in its journey, regardless of whether it's labelled preparedness or recovery.
Yes, may I say, I think that's a really vital point. The point you made about projects that in and of themselves good, great, you know, and yet we all know the short-termism, the impact, the long-term thing, it's really hard to do that. And that's a systemic issue there is, especially around electoral cycles and authorities and all those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. May we open another question, please?
Hello, Corrie Williams, Master Builders Victoria. I was just wondering, have you seen examples in other industries or with other issues where these place-based and system change approaches have been successful? Have you seen this model work and be translated into other areas?
I think in general, we're seeing community action doing really important work. And if we look globally around the climate movement, like it's an old moniker, but you know, think global, act local. You know, this idea of local action and place-based work has been part of our fabric, but I think more recently we're really leaning into it in terms of, investing and, understanding what it takes for local actors to come together. I think there's all kinds of really great collectives and so on, but I wonder what it would look like to be really intentional about that and to have all our institutional settings set up to really grow and foster that.
I've never met anybody who's ever said community-led, community-centred is not the right approach, and yet the tools that we have, and you relate to command and control, and of course we need that in the immediacy of a disaster, of course we do, and yet after that, command and control can be a problem when it comes to locally owned, place-based approaches, as you're saying. It's a challenge that we're all aware of, and it's hard to square.
And the communities we're working with, some of them say that the bushfire, it was traumatising, but in fact the deeper trauma came from the disempowering that happened in the aftermath. Outsiders coming in, taking over community pop-up centres that had been established to support really local recovery efforts. An outsider coming in, taking over, disempowering and deprioritising the things that the communities had decided for themselves as being important. So I think that's something to be really mindful when thinking about trauma and experience. It's not just that disaster moment where, of course, you need command and control when you're trying to evacuate and move people around to be safe, but that's that moment. And so what's the long journey ahead and what had been the long journey before that was empowering of community?
Oh, totally. Great, thank you. There was a hand up from a gentleman there.
Hi, Briony and David. Thanks for this inspiring lecture. It's truly mind-blowing. I'm actually a student here. I'm finishing up my master's degree of property developments. Today is actually my last day being a student here. Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
So I'm actually working with a number of classmates on collaborating a startup company on modular buildings, and in particularly looking at tender for the Aboriginal housing projects in around regional New South Wales. So what you discussed just then in terms of consulting the Indigenous community and also the elders and knowledge really hits in my heart, because that's something what we are actually consulting to build sustainable modular homes to sustain floods, fire, as well as suitable for the Aboriginal culture. However, this is the business part. This next is the business part of me. I'm very commercialized, but I'd like to know, how does business can be involved on your project, the fire to flourish? Because I'm hearing a lot of funding plans. It's all government-driven and community-driven. But I think there's a power of commercial, there's a power of business, such as a startup. I'd like to know what your vision and how do you think that is a pathway for business to get involved with your project and with that overall vision ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, the business community is really critical, and if we think about community as that place-based system, the role of business in a really local scale is critical, and getting businesses up and running after a disaster has been hit to provide that critical resource and capacity in community to support the longer term recovery has been a really important function in community. So I think at that local scale, business is really important, but we can also be thinking at the broader scale. One of our collaboration partners is Australian Business Volunteers. And what we're seeing in our communities is they might have amazing, really promising ideas around how they want to invest in recovery efforts or shape the future, but some communities happen to have had retired professionals that live in their community and are able to volunteer their time to help bring a project to life, but many don't. And so what do those communities do? How do they access that professional expertise or all the capacity that exists in our business community? And so Australian Business Volunteers, one of their programs, is providing that network of business professionals that can be a resource for community to draw on to access that expertise in really self-determined ways. And I think there's all kinds of innovative thinking that we can be doing around how business as part of this ecosystem, again, that systems thinking, what are the different resources and capacities that we have in this country or in this community, and how do we set ourselves up to mobilise and harness them all to be of service to community? This is something that we're thinking about at Monash University, and we've got it's great to hear about your degree that you just finished. The placemaking work that we had a small video we're actually building in collaboration with our Masters of Planning, Masters of Urban Planning and Masters of Architecture. So those workshops that were being facilitated was actually our Masters students running studios to go out to community and provide facilitation support, design support, to listen to community ideas, help them understand their local place, and then convert those ideas into concept plans that they can then be put to the community for them to figure out, co-develop, prioritise, and then we'll be offering grant funding to help the community to be able to take those concepts into the next stages of development. I think this is just a taste of some of the innovative thinking we could be doing in the university world around how can university be a capacity for community to draw on, because there's so much knowledge and skills and infrastructure and systems and passion that exists within universities, within the student body, within the research community, the university staff in general. So what could it look like for us to bring down the walls of universities so that we are there to be of service to community through partnership?
That sounds like a perfect ending, especially as thank you and congratulations again. And we'll see you on the stage here when you graduate soon enough. So it seems like a good way to end. A couple of thank yous. Thank you very much to Emma Stoden, to team, to others for putting this on. We have refreshments outside. Please do join us and stay. But most of all, you won't be surprised for me to say thank you so much, Briony Rogers. Briony, you're heading pretty much straight back to Melbourne to lead a workshop first thing tomorrow morning. You're super busy and we're so grateful, and thank you again for sharing real inspiration, I think. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Great. Well done.